When we talk about the avoidant mindset, the very first step is to stop taking their behavior personally. Because if you don't understand what's happening beneath the surface, every pushback, every withdrawal, every silence will feel like rejection. And when you feel rejected, the natural impulse is to chase, to prove your worth, or to lower your boundaries just to hold on to them. That cycle not only erodes your self-respect, but it also reinforces their deepest fear that closeness is unsafe. So, the foundation of everything I'm sharing with you today begins with this: you have to see the world through their lens before you can ever set a boundary that works. Avoidant individuals aren't cold, and they're not heartless. In fact, many of them feel emotions more deeply than they're willing to admit. The problem isn't a lack of feeling. It's the fear of being overwhelmed by those feelings. Somewhere in their past, usually in childhood, they learned that vulnerability equaled danger. Maybe they had parents who dismissed their needs, or caregivers who were physically present but emotionally unavailable. The message they absorbed was simple: if I show too much of myself, if I rely on someone, I'll get hurt. That belief becomes hardwired. It shapes how they love, how they fight, how they respond to closeness. And here's the irony. The avoidant does want connection. They do want love. They want partnership, intimacy, and safety just like anyone else. But the closer they get to those things, the more it triggers the survival system that says, run, retreat, shut down. That's why you'll see them pull away right when things start to feel good. It's not about you. It's about the script running in their nervous system. Now, why does this matter for you? Because if you don't understand this wiring, you'll misinterpret their behavior. You'll think, they don't care, they're selfish, they're impossible to love. And that's not the full truth. When you carry that misunderstanding into your interactions, your boundaries come from a place of punishment instead of empowerment. You start to think, if I cut them off, if I give them the silent treatment, if I make them jealous, they'll come running back. But manipulation is not a boundary. Manipulation is insecurity dressed up as power, and an avoidant will sniff it out instantly. So, the real work begins in reframing. You stop asking, how can I make them stay? And you start asking, how can I honor who I am while giving them the space they need to feel safe? That shift in mindset is radical. It's the moment you stop chasing their approval and start leading with your own clarity. Because the truth is, when an avoidant feels that you respect yourself, when they sense that you're not willing to sacrifice your dignity to keep them, that's when they start to relax. They start to trust. They start to lean in. Think about it like this. Imagine someone is terrified of drowning. If you push them into the deep end of a pool, even if you know they can swim, they're going to panic. They'll thrash, they'll resist, they'll do everything they can to get away from the water. But if you invite them to sit at the edge, if you show them the shallow end, if you let them dip their toes in without pressure, eventually their body learns that the water is safe. Avoidants need that same sense of gradual trust. And the boundary that begins to build that safety is rooted in your understanding of where they're coming from. This doesn't mean excusing every behavior. It doesn't mean tolerating neglect or disrespect. It means you lead with compassion, but you anchor yourself in strength. You recognize that their retreat is not a verdict on your worth. It's a symptom of their fear. And when you can hold that perspective, you stop reacting from desperation. Instead, you respond from clarity, from calm, from a place that says, I understand your fear, but I won't abandon myself to soothe it. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop taking their fear personally, The moment you stop bending yourself into shapes to earn their closeness, you become magnetic. You're no longer another person demanding from them what they're terrified to give. You're a person who stands firm, who offers connection without pressure, who respects their boundaries while holding your own. That balance, empathy without self-abandonment, is the exact thing that begins to unravel their fear of love. So if you take nothing else from this first point, take this: the avoidant mindset is not about rejecting you. It's about protecting themselves. And the way to break through that wall isn't by forcing it down, but by understanding why it's there in the first place. When you can see their fear without losing sight of your value, you hold the key to connection. Because love with an avoidant doesn't start with demanding closeness. It starts with creating safety. And safety begins the moment you decide that their fear is not a reflection of your worth, but an invitation for you to rise into your own strength. When it comes to relationships with avoidance, most people make the same mistake over and over again. They think that if they give more, love harder, sacrifice more of themselves, the avoidant will finally feel safe and choose them. But the truth is, the very thing that awakens attraction and respect in an avoidant is not your sacrifice. It's your self-respect. Think about this. People don't fall in love with the parts of you that bend and break under pressure. They fall in love with the parts of you that stand firm, that show them who you are when you refuse to betray yourself. And that's exactly why boundaries rooted in self-respect are so powerful. They communicate something without you having to say a word. I value myself enough to not chase what runs, to not beg for what should be given freely, and to not shrink in the hope of keeping your love. Avoidants live with an underlying fear that closeness will erase them. They are terrified of being swallowed up, controlled, or suffocated. When you approach them with neediness, constant reassurance, seeking, or an endless list of compromises, you unintentionally play right into that fear. You confirm their suspicion that love equals pressure. And so they pull back. But when you approach them with calm self-respect, when your actions show that you are secure in who you are and that their distance doesn't define your value, you actually disarm that fear. They start to realize that closeness with you doesn't mean losing themselves. Here's the beauty of it. Self-respect is magnetic because it creates emotional safety. When you respect yourself, you don't over-pursue. You don't drown them in demands. You don't panic every time they pull away. Instead, you hold your ground. You show up consistently, but you're not clinging. You offer love, but you're not begging. And that balance of warmth and independence is exactly what allows an avoidant to lower their guard. Now, self-respect is not about building walls or playing hard to get. It's not about punishing them or acting indifferent. Those are games, and games never lead to authentic love. Self-respect is much deeper. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth doesn't rise and fall with someone else's availability. It's the steady inner voice that says, I am enough, whether you can meet me here or not. And that voice guides how you show up, how you respond, and how you set boundaries. Let me put it in practical terms. Imagine you send them a message, and they don't respond right away. The insecure part of you wants to double text, to call, to spiral into fear. But self-respect says, I'll give them space. I'm not going to lose my peace over silence. Or picture them pulling back emotionally after a weekend of closeness. The fearful part of you wants to chase, to demand answers, to corner them into reassurance. But self-respect says, I can hold this tension. I don't have to smother them to feel safe. Those moments, small as they seem, are where attraction is built. Because what you're really showing is that your sense of worth isn't fragile. And here's where the philosophical depth comes in. Love is not about erasing yourself to win someone over. That's not love. That's self-abandonment. Real love requires two whole people choosing each other freely, not one person shrinking so the other feels comfortable. When you respect yourself, you embody that wholeness. You say without words, I am not here to complete you, and I don't need you to complete me. I am here because I choose you, and I hope you choose me too. That message lands in a way no amount of pleading or proving ever could. What makes this so transformative is that it creates a paradox the avoidant can't resist. On one hand, you're emotionally available. You're not cold. You're not detached. You're not punishing. But on the other hand, you're grounded in your own self-worth. That combination, warmth without desperation, becomes irresistible. It's the balance they've been longing for, but didn't know how to find. So the next time you feel the urge to chase, to overextend, to mold yourself into what you think they want, pause. Remember that every time you betray yourself to gain love, you teach the other person that your needs don't matter. And if your needs don't matter, your presence won't either. But every time you stand in your self-respect, every time you choose not to abandon yourself, you send the opposite message. Being with me is a privilege, not an obligation. And that, more than anything else, is what makes an avoidant feel safe enough to stay. Because in the end, love rooted in fear will always collapse, but love rooted in self-respect. That is the kind of love that expands, deepens, and lasts. So here's the truth I want you to carry with you. The strongest boundary you can ever set with an avoidant is not about controlling their behavior. It's about honoring your own value. When you stop sacrificing yourself in the name of love, you don't just attract respect. You create the very conditions where love can finally grow. When we talk about boundaries with avoidance, the one that carries the most weight is the boundary of emotional availability. And let me be very clear here. Emotional availability does not mean overextending yourself, pouring endlessly into the relationship, or bending so far that you lose yourself in the process. That's not availability. That's desperation disguised as devotion. Real emotional availability means you're open, you're present, you're willing to connect, but you don't abandon your center to make that happen. Avoidants are hyper, attuned to pressure. The moment they feel that your love comes with a hidden contract, I'll give you everything, but you better give me back what I want, they retreat. It's not because they don't care. It's because they equate that hidden demand with danger. They grew up believing that leaning on someone would only end in disappointment or suffocation. So when they sense that your love is conditional, even in subtle ways, their protective system kicks in. They shut down to survive. Here's the paradox, though. Avoidants don't fall in love with people who smother them, and they don't fall in love with people who withhold either. What draws them in is someone who can hold space without collapsing into neediness. Someone who is emotionally available, meaning open, present, warm, but not emotionally dependent, meaning you don't need them to regulate your sense of self-worth. That difference is everything. Think of it like a dance. If you step forward with warmth and openness, and they step back out of fear, your job is not to chase them across the floor. Your job is to stay rooted, to keep the door open, but to let them feel that stepping forward again will be their choice. That's what emotional availability as a boundary looks like in action. I'm here, I'm open, but I won't twist myself into knots or abandon myself to pull you closer. Let's ground this in real life examples. if they go quiet for a couple of days, emotional availability doesn't mean bombarding them with texts or giving them the cold shoulder in revenge. It means you continue living your life, you keep your emotional doors open, but you don't demand that they soothe your anxiety in that moment. When they do come back, you welcome them with calm presence, not punishment. Or, if they're struggling to express themselves, you don't push, prod, or interrogate. You simply show that you're ready to listen when they are, while still holding your own center of gravity. That balance sends a powerful message. I'm safe to connect with, but I don't need to control you to feel safe. And for an avoidant, that's revolutionary. Because for the first time, love doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like an invitation. Now, let's talk about why this works on a deeper psychological level. Human beings crave connection. It's wired into our nervous systems. But for the avoidant, that craving is tangled up with fear. Every time they get close, the alarm bells go off. What helps quiet those alarms is not someone shouting louder, not someone demanding reassurance, but someone showing through their behavior that love can exist without control. That's what emotional availability, balanced with boundaries, communicates. You're saying, I can handle closeness, but I can also handle distance. I don't need to collapse into you to love you. That steadiness is exactly what allows their nervous system to relax. And when they relax, they can finally step closer. Philosophically, there's a bigger lesson here too. True intimacy doesn't come from clinging, it comes from choosing. And choice only exists when there's freedom. When you're emotionally available without overextending, you give the avoidant the freedom to choose connection instead of feeling forced into it. That's why this boundary is so magnetic. It transforms love from something that feels like a demand into something that feels like a gift. And here's where the reflection comes in for you. Are you truly available, or are you performing availability while secretly demanding a guarantee in return? Because availability without self-respect becomes self-erasure. But availability with self-respect becomes love at its purest, love that says, I'm here, and I'm whole with or without your response. That kind of love doesn't suffocate, it inspires. So if you want to set the boundary that matters most, let it be this: you will offer presence without pressure, love without self-abandonment, and openness without overgiving. You will be emotionally available, but never at the expense of your own center. Because in the end, what avoidants fall in love with is not someone who tries to fix them, chase them, or fill in their missing pieces. What they fall in love with is someone who stands strong in their own wholeness and says, I'm here if you want to join me, but I don't need to lose myself for us to connect. That's the boundary that turns fear into trust and trust into love. One of the most overlooked truths in relationships with avoidance is that consistency and control are not the same thing. In fact, they are opposites. Consistency is about creating stability, while control is about creating pressure. And pressure is the one thing that makes avoidance run faster than anything else. If you want to build a connection with someone who fears closeness, you have to learn the difference between showing up with reliability versus showing up with demands. Let me explain it like this. Imagine someone who grew up never knowing what version of their caregiver they would get. Sometimes warmth, sometimes coldness, sometimes nothing at all. That unpredictability hardwires them to both crave connection and distrust it. The avoidant carries this programming into adulthood. What heals that wound isn't someone hovering, micromanaging, or controlling. It's someone who consistently shows up without adding more weight to the relationship. The avoidant doesn't need perfection, but they do need a sense of steadiness, a sense that you are who you say you are, without hidden strings attached. And here's the key. Consistency doesn't mean flooding them with attention every hour of the day. Consistency is not intensity. It's not about doing more. It's about being steady in who you are. If you say you'll call, you call. If you say you'll be there, you show up. If you're kind one day, you don't turn distant or punishing the next because of their behavior. Consistency means your love is grounded, dependable, and predictable in the healthiest way. Now contrast that with control. Control is when you start keeping score. Control is when you give to get, or when you subtly demand that they meet your emotional needs on your timeline. It's when you text not because you want to connect, but because you want to provoke a reaction. It's when you give love, but secretly attach conditions to it. Avoidance can feel that a mile away. And what happens when they sense control? They withdraw. They pull back because control feels like entrapment, and for them, entrapment is the ultimate threat. But consistency, true, grounded consistency, creates safety. And safety is the one thing avoidance don't realize they're searching for, but cannot resist once they feel it. Imagine being in a storm and seeing one solid lighthouse in the distance. That's what you become when you're consistent. You don't run after the ship. You don't scream at it to come closer. You don't flash your light brighter out of desperation. You just shine steadily. And eventually, the ship notices. It realizes the light is always there, unwavering. That's when it feels safe enough to steer closer. This is why consistency without control is so powerful. It shows the avoidant that love doesn't have to feel like pressure. It shows them that intimacy doesn't have to mean a loss of freedom. You are giving them a new experience. Love that is stable but not suffocating, committed but not consuming. That contrast is what makes them lower their guard and begin to trust. Let me be real here, this requires strength. Because consistency is not glamorous. It's not about dramatic gestures or proving your worth. It's about quiet, steady alignment with your values, even when their behavior triggers your insecurities. And that takes discipline. When they pull back, you don't retaliate. When they get close, you don't panic about when they'll leave again. You keep showing up as yourself, grounded, steady, calm. That consistency isn't just for them. It's for you. It's the practice of living in your own integrity, no matter what storm is happening around you. And philosophically, this points to something bigger. Relationships at their healthiest aren't about control at all. They're about choice. Control tries to force love. Consistency allows love to grow. When you practice consistency without trying to control the outcome, you create the conditions where love can be freely chosen. And chosen love is the only kind of love that lasts. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Are you being consistent? Or are you trying to control? Because one builds trust and the other destroys it. One communicates safety and the other communicates fear. One makes love possible and the other makes love feel like a trap. If you want an avoidant to fall in love, don't push, don't chase, and don't control. Be consistent. Be the lighthouse, not the storm. Because love doesn't grow where there is control. Love grows where there is safety. And safety comes from the quiet, steady power of consistency. When most people hear the word space in relationships, they think of distance. They imagine coldness, detachment, a pulling away that signals something is wrong. But space, when it's created from the right place, is not distance. It's oxygen. And in relationships with avoidance, oxygen is everything. Avoidants are constantly walking the tightrope between wanting intimacy and fearing it. Their nervous system is wired to detect closeness as a potential threat as if being too deeply known will somehow strip away their freedom. So when you flood them with attention, when you chase them down emotionally, what they feel isn't love, it's suffocation. And suffocation is the fastest way to push them further away. But when you learn to create space, not walls, not punishment, but intentional, respectful space, you transform that fear into curiosity. Suddenly, they're not running away. They're leaning in. Here's the paradox: the less you chase, the more they come toward you. The more freedom they feel, the safer they become. And when they feel safe, they start to allow themselves to love. It's counterintuitive, because our instinct when someone pulls back is to close the gap, to get closer, to cling. But clinging is about soothing your own fear, not theirs. What actually draws them closer is your ability to tolerate the space without panicking. That's when they start to trust you. Think about fire for a moment. If you smother it with too much wood, too much pressure, it goes out. But if you give it air, if you allow space for oxygen to flow, it grows brighter and stronger. Love with an avoidant works the same way. The right amount of space doesn't kill the flame, it feeds it. And the irony is that space, rather than separating you, becomes the very thing that allows connection to deepen. Now let's make this practical. Creating space doesn't mean withdrawing affection. It doesn't mean playing games or pretending you don't care. That's avoidance on your side, and it only mirrors their fears. Creating space means respecting their rhythm while still standing firmly in your own. If they need time alone, you give it to them without resentment. If they need to retreat for a moment, you don't chase them down with questions or ultimatums. Instead, you hold steady. You keep living your life. You show that their need for breathing room doesn't destabilize your sense of self. What does that communicate? It tells the avoidant, you can be yourself here. You don't have to disappear to feel safe with me. You have space to breathe, and I will still be here, whole and steady, when you're ready to step closer again. That message is powerful because it replaces fear with freedom. And when someone feels free in your presence, they start to choose you, not out of obligation, not out of fear of loss, but out of genuine desire. Philosophically, this is about understanding the nature of love itself. Love is not about possession. It's not about holding someone so tightly that they can't move. Love is about expansion. It's about creating a container big enough that both people can breathe, grow, and still meet in the middle. When you create space in a relationship, what you're really saying is, I trust you enough to not grip you. I trust myself enough to not collapse without you. And I trust love enough to let it breathe. That trust is magnetic. It's the antidote to fear. Now, this doesn't mean you tolerate endless distance or accept neglect. There's a difference between giving space and accepting disconnection. The key is balance. You allow space without abandoning your own needs. You can say, I respect that you need time, but I also need communication. I'm willing to give you room, but I won't disappear into silence. That way, you create space while still protecting your own heart. That balance is what keeps you from losing yourself while inviting them to come closer. And here's what's fascinating. The moment they realize that your love doesn't demand their constant presence, the moment they see that you don't need to consume them to stay connected, they begin to let down their walls. For the avoidant, that's the turning point. Because what they've feared their entire life, being trapped, being consumed, is suddenly replaced with the experience of freedom within closeness. And that is what makes them fall in love. So if you're with someone avoidant, don't see space as rejection. See it as part of the dance. Space, when handled with confidence and respect, is not distance. It's attraction. It's the invisible pull that makes them want to step forward of their own free will. Because love that's chosen is always stronger than love that's chased. And the only way to give them the freedom to choose you is to let space become your ally, not your enemy. So remember, this space doesn't push love away. Space, when it's held with confidence, is what makes love possible. At the heart of it all, the single boundary that truly shifts everything with avoidance comes down to this: choosing yourself first. And I know that sounds simple, almost cliché, but when you really live it, when you embody it, it changes the entire dynamic. Because the truth is, avoidants don't fall in love with people who lose themselves in the relationship. They fall in love with people who stand tall in their own identity, who show that being with them is an addition, not a necessity. Think about it. So many of us are taught that love means sacrifice. That to prove your devotion, you should put your partner's needs before your own, bend when they pull, soften when they withdraw, and accept less just to keep the connection alive. But that kind of self-abandonment doesn't create love, it breeds resentment. It tells the other person that you will tolerate being minimized. And the truth is, if you keep teaching someone that your boundaries are negotiable, they'll start to believe you don't have any worth protecting. Choosing yourself first is not about arrogance. It's not about selfishness. It's about self-honoring. It's the decision to live in alignment with your values, even when that alignment might cost you the relationship. It's about saying, I want love, but not at the expense of my peace. I want closeness, but not if it means losing my voice. I want partnership, but not if it requires me to erase myself to keep you comfortable. That is the kind of stance that earns respect, not just from avoidance, but from anyone. And here's where it gets interesting: avoidance, despite their fear of intimacy, actually admire strength. They may resist vulnerability, but they are drawn to people who are rooted in themselves. When you choose yourself first, you send a very clear message. I don't need you to complete me. I am already whole. And that message is irresistible because it creates a relationship built on want, not on need. And love that comes from want, not desperation, is the only kind that lasts. Now, choosing yourself first doesn't mean you never compromise. Relationships require flexibility, give and take, mutual care. But there's a line between compromise and collapse. Compromise says, I can bend without breaking. I can meet you halfway without abandoning myself. Collapse says, I'll erase my needs so you'll stay. And the second you start collapsing, you teach the avoidant that your value is conditional, that your boundaries can be bent until they vanish. That dynamic doesn't make them love you more. It makes them pull back because deep down, they don't trust what isn't anchored. So let's get practical. Choosing yourself first means you know when to say no. It means you can walk away from a dynamic that repeatedly depletes you. It means you hold your standards, not as threats, but as non-negotiables for the kind of life and love you want to live. And paradoxically, it's that strength that makes the avoidant lean in. Because suddenly, they're not looking at someone who will chase them, cling to them, or control them. They're looking at someone who is free and who invites them into that same freedom. Philosophically, this is about understanding that love is not about losing yourself. It's about expanding yourself. And expansion can only happen when both people bring their full selves to the table. When you choose yourself first, you're not only protecting your worth, you're modeling what healthy love looks like. You're showing the avoidant that intimacy doesn't mean entrapment. It means two whole people choosing each other every day, without fear, without control, without collapse. And here's the deeper truth, the ultimate boundary, the one that changes everything, is the refusal to abandon yourself. Because when you stop abandoning yourself, two things happen. First, you break the old cycle of self-sacrifice that drains relationships of their vitality. And second, you create a presence that is so magnetic, so grounded, that the avoidant begins to feel safe enough to step into love. Not because you begged them, not because you manipulated them, but because your strength inspired them. So if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this: the boundary that makes avoidance fall in love isn't about controlling them. It isn't about chasing them. And it isn't about proving your worth. It's about living in such alignment with yourself that love with you feels like freedom, not a burden. Because the person who chooses themselves first doesn't just attract love. They attract respect, trust, and admiration. And respect, trust, and admiration are the foundation of a love that lasts. So hold this thought close: love doesn't cost you your identity. And if it does, it's not love. The moment you choose yourself first is the moment you become the kind of person who is impossible not to love.